Well, the Russia-Ukraine conflict seems destined to enter an even more complicated phase in the months ahead, despite the US and allies' continued ambitious efforts to bolster the Ukrainians. There are no signs of an endgame in the war. Analysts say Moscow is seeking to alter the Western-led system prevailing since the end of the Cold War. Western allies say the war has broken the entire security architecture built patiently on the European continent over many decades. Amid India's balancing act on the war, Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky are set to meet in Japan. Let's have a look at what's happening now and back then as pertains to India and the ongoing conflict. First of all, the meeting on the sidelines of the G7 summit in Hiroshima marks the first in-person talks between the two leaders since the war began. Also, Narendra Modi got on the phone with Zelensky and also Putin to discuss the situation in Ukraine on multiple occasions since Russia's invasion in 2022. Over the years, India's security cooperation with Western nations has increased. New Delhi continues to rely on Moscow for defense and also oil imports. Remember, India has long-standing security ties with Russia. So far, New Delhi has refused to condemn Moscow for the Ukraine invasion. However, last year, Prime Minister Narendra Modi told Putin, this is not the era for war. In April, Ukraine's Deputy Foreign Minister visited New Delhi. So these are the points, or this is what connects India with the conflict ongoing in Ukraine. And for more on this, we are now being joined by our principal diplomatic correspondent, Sidhant Sibol, live from Hiroshima. Sidhant Sibol, good to see you. It's the second day of the summit in Hiroshima. What should we expect today?
Well, today the focus will be on how the G7 countries can come up with a stronger set of sanctions. We know that it is given, in fact, a short while ago, there was a briefing by the White House in which the White House officials pointed out as to how the Americans are going to announce support for Ukraine in terms of training of the Ukrainian pilots. F-16s is something that has been talked about. But essentially, if you look at the overall agenda of the grouping, while the Russian President Vladimir Putin and the Chinese President Xi Jinping both haven't been invited for the summit, both are topping the agenda of the summit. We have seen various readouts coming. In fact, there was a session on Ukraine as well. And if you look at the commentary coming from Hiroshima, from the G7 grouping, the focus remains as to how the conflict can be halted. But if it can't be halted, there needs to be stronger concrete measures against the Russians and support for the Ukraine. In fact, White House also said that the Ukrainian President Zelensky will be having a meeting with the American President Joe Biden. Of course, the Japanese side also confirmed a meeting with the Japanese Prime Minister, who is the host. So, whole host of meeting for the Ukrainian President and a message for Moscow.
Sidhant Sibol, we've been talking about the meeting, or the highly anticipated meeting between Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and also the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. He's also supposed to meet the other 8 invited countries to the Hiroshima summit. What more do we know about this meeting?
Well, we right now haven't got a confirmation from the 8 countries of, in fact, of the 8 countries, 1 country is looking forward to it, that's India. But other countries haven't said anything. We haven't seen any readout when it comes to any meeting with President Zelensky. But for President Zelensky, this is an opportunity to meet the 7 developed countries which form the G7 grouping, but also the 8 invited countries, which include countries who are seen as major countries of the global south, like India, Indonesia and Vietnam as well. Also countries of the Indo-Pacific. The Australian Prime Minister is already here, and we know that how the Japanese have been focusing on the Indo-Pacific. But coming back to the meeting, highly anticipated meeting as you termed it, because this is the first meeting between the two leaders since the conflict started last year. The last in-person meeting between the two leaders, the Indian Prime Minister and the Ukrainian President, was in November of 2021. in Glasgow on the sidelines of the climate meeting. But since then, geopolitics has substantially changed, and we know that this time when the meeting happens, the Ukrainian side will be keen that India, as the chair of the G20 grouping, invites President Zelensky to address the G20 summit. Now, India has already dished out the invites to various countries like Bangladesh, UAE. So there is no clarity as of now that will India invite President Zelensky to attend the G20 summit. Last year, we saw the Indonesians, as the president of the G20, did invite President Zelensky, and he addressed the meeting virtually.
Finally, Sidhansibol, yesterday we saw a photo opportunity or a photo op between the leaders and the delegates, the prime ministers, the heads of state who are attending this Hiroshima summit. Today, there is curiosity as to whether the other 8 invited presidents and prime ministers will have a photo op at the Peace Park. Do we know more about that?
Well, yes, of course, that is scheduled. That's going to happen. We know that this will be part of the G7 outreach outreach summit. In fact, all the 8 countries will be going to the Peace Park on Sunday morning as well. But essentially that large family photo of the G7 member countries and the invited countries is sure to happen. Last year we saw in Germany that meeting happening, that family photo op happening, and we saw how the French president and the American president had that warm exchanges with the Indian Prime Minister. So this time as well, focus will be on the body language, but apart from body language, the focus will be on hard diplomacy as well. We know that when it comes to Indian Prime Minister's schedule, this is part of the agenda, but also number of bilaterals. He earlier this morning held a bilateral with the Japanese Prime Minister, who is the host of this year's G7 summit.
Live from Hiroshima, Japan, our principal diplomatic correspondent, Sidhansibol. Thank you. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.